Danielle, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, I am really glad that we're getting a chance to talk because this topic of exercise has come up a lot. And it's certainly over the last 2 years, something that we hear women talking about consistently. But, I think maybe people feel like they have had quarantine, so they've had to make specific time to go and do something physical. Can you talk a little bit, introduce yourself, but talk a
Mhm.
little bit about your career and how you ended up getting into the idea of writing Let's Get Physical?
Absolutely. So, I have been a women's health journalist for the past 15 years. I actually started my career as a book editor, a nonfiction book editor at Two Imprints of Penguin,
Mm.
and which certainly came in handy when it was time for me to write a book. But
Mhm.
I left book publishing for journalism, and um, I held various roles as part of the senior editorial staff at the Daily Beast in its early days, at NBC News Digital, at a startup called Fusion. And while I covered a little bit of everything, I always came back to women's health, as well as kind of the intersection of women's health with gender, sexuality, and popular culture. Um, and it was that beat that really led me to this topic that I write about in Let's Get Physical, and the book project in general. Um, I hadn't actually written that much about women's fitness before the book. I was focused a little bit more on reproductive health and maternity issues. But the book came about when I took my first barre class, my first barre workout class. I am a lifelong runner, but I had never really um, delved into partaken in boutique fitness. And I decided to check out barre, and I was just kind of fascinated by the whole barre subculture. I also, because I was doing a lot of reporting on on women's sexual health at the time, was sort of wondering whether the workout had a positive impact on women's sexual health, because it's very based on um, tucks and pelvic thrusts. And
Mhm.
basically, one thing led to another, and I stumbled on this incredibly fascinating history of barre and of Lottie Burke, the woman who invented barre in the late 1950s. I wrote about that story for New York Magazine's The Cut, and the story went viral. And it was while researching that and just seeing the response that I knew there was a larger story to tell here. I really couldn't believe that nobody had written a book about the history and evolution of women's fitness culture.
Mm. Well, let's talk a little bit first before we dive into that about what is barre, because I also you in the book you also talk about Bonnie Pruden, and I want to talk about
Mm-hmm.
her. But
Mm-hmm.
what is barre? For those of us who are not familiar with it, can you quickly kind of explain what kind of exercise it is?
Yes, yes. So the barre workout phenomenon has become a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Mm.
The workout itself is based on basically these kind of teeny tiny isometric resistance exercises performed largely at a ballet barre. That's where it gets its name from.
Mm.
Also on a mat. And Lottie Burke herself was a former dancer who there's a long, very complicated story in the book, very colorful story, but who was sort of starting a new chapter of her life in her 40s, and invented this workout that combined what she had learned through ballet with yoga and what we would now call physical therapy. And the workout does make you very strong very quickly,
Mm.
but it's also marketed as a way for women to um, you know lift, tone, and burn their bodies, and to strive for basically the stereotypical dancer's physique.
Mm.
um, so, and yes, I'm glad you mentioned Bonnie Pruden. And I'll just say that the book begins in the 1950s. Each chapter, as we work our way up to the present, really focuses on a different pioneer, female pioneer from each era and each major movement of women's fitness, and shows how everything is interconnected and, leads us up to the present.
So let's, if we can, and I'm glad that that you mentioned Bonnie Pruden, because she also was responsible for a big shift in how we women thought about exercising. Can you talk a little bit about who she was and some of the things that she has contributed in this space?
Yes. So Bonnie Pruden is really a forgotten pioneer of not just fitness, but not just fitness for women, but the idea that for men, women, and children, moving regularly, incorporating movement into our lives, can impact our overall sense of well-being. She opens my book. She first kind of rose to prominence in the 1950s and 60s. She was actually on the cover of Sports Illustrated in 1957 and went on to have one of the very first TV fitness shows in the 1960s. And there could be, to be honest, there could be books written just about Bonnie, but for the sake of brevity, I'll say that in the context of the history that I tell, she was really impactful in that she did explicitly tell women that it was appropriate for them to exercise. Because the thing to understand is that at the time, in the post-World War II era, which was a time of really strict gender norms and social norms, for women, vigorous, strenuous exercise was really considered, was just incredibly radical. So Bonnie, was very savvy in her messaging, and she encouraged women to sweat and to do push-ups, and she had all sorts of little Bonnieisms, little taglines. One of them was under every curve there's a muscle, no curve, which is sort of, again, maybe not so scientifically sound, but she got her point across. The thing, the sort of flip side, and this is a theme that is woven throughout this whole story, is that because selling strength for strength's sake would have sort of been, that message would have been just laughed at, Bonnie and some of the early pioneers basically learned to package exercise for women as a beauty tool. As, yes, it will make you feel good. Women should be strong. There's nothing unladylike about muscle. And yet, at the same time, it will make you more attractive to your male partner. It will make you more conventionally, have a more conventionally attractive figure. So that kind of tension is woven throughout the entire history of women's fitness.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit then about the evolution, because it does strike me that certainly for many years, and I remember the Jane Fonda era, where everyone was kind of doing aerobics, right, in their leg warmers and whatever, and that was the craze for a while. But I think that where we are today, and maybe, and I would love to get your perspective on this, but I seem to hear much more as it relates to exercise that connects it to mental well-being, and not just about the physical, like you're going to look better. Yes. I mean, yes, that's a buy. So it's almost like the exact opposite of what Bonnie Pruden and some of the other female pioneers in the space had to do, where they focused more on the attractiveness first and then the other benefits after. Do you think that we are in a different time now in terms of how exercise is being discussed and what the benefits are?
Yes, I think we're at the beginning of a shift. I very intentionally titled the first chapter of my book, the Bonnie Pruden chapter, Reduce, and the last chapter, Expand, because I think we are at a moment of expanding our ideas of what exercise can be for, of what a fit body looks like, of who fitness is for. The way I kind of see it is that throughout this whole history, exercise as a beauty tool and exercise as a path to empowerment were kind of, just inextricably interwoven. And in order to reap the benefits of fitness culture, women had to also kind of put up with this other layer of pressure and sometimes, frankly, toxicity. But I think, which is not to say that women haven't been able to carve a very empowering path throughout the past several decades. So many women I interviewed who are now in their 70s, 80s, and older talked about how the thing that got them in the door was the promise of physical transformation and beauty and weight loss. But the thing that made them stay was the discovery of these more profound benefits. But the change that I've seen more recently is that those threads really are starting to be untangled. And, women are pushing back against the idea that fitness, that there is, first of all, that there's one ideal we should all be striving for, that should be the primary goal, that we need to change the way we look to be acceptable or lovable. And so, it can be, I've spoken with people who kind of fall on different sides of this issue, but I will say that whether it's for, whatever it represents, the language of fitness culture has definitely started to change over the past, say, 5 years. Many fitness professionals, whereas, in the early aughts, would just openly talk about working toward a bikini body or focusing on your problem areas, cringe at the way they used to talk about fitness. And today focus, just don't talk about physical appearance at all, and really do focus on the mental, emotional, and physical health benefits. So it's very exciting to see that beginning to shift. There's more body diversity. There are more options today, but I think we're at the beginning of that shift.
Well, if we can talk a little bit about since you were able to talk with so many people thinking through the decades since the 50s, where we started having women more focused on exercise. What would you say today the latest and greatest thinking is on the benefits of exercising?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head with mental health. I think that and that's something that has just been, learned firsthand, I think, by so many women and men, but focusing it on women. And I, this is certainly true for me, as someone who, like I said, I'm a lifelong runner, and I know, I know intimately how having access to running and to the opportunity to run has shaped my identity, shaped my sense of physical confidence and trust in my body. And I can talk more about that, but I think, we're seeing there have been a growing number of, books and scientific studies over the past few years about the mental health benefits, which, there's so many components to it, because there's the social and community component. And especially when you look at, for example, just like aging, we know how important it is to feel connected to a larger community. And for so many women, particularly baby boomers and older, they're finding that through fitness. So there's that sense. There's also the physiological benefits. One of my favorite discoveries while researching the book was that when we move in sync with other people, our bodies release neurotransmitters that contribute to a sense of purpose in life and hope and social connection. So it's all, it's all interconnected, but I think rightly there has been an increasing focus on that aspect.
Wow. I had never thought about the community elements of fitness. And, I'm somebody who never thought of myself as an exerciser. I mean, I was always relatively active, but during COVID, I bought a rower. And I thought, well, am I ever going to use this? I want to, because I like the idea of rowing. And I started doing it, started building the habit of doing it. And for me, it's not about the change in my body at all. It's not about losing weight. It's not about any of that, because if it were, honestly, I probably would have stopped, because it's not like you get a huge impact. I mean, you have to burn a lot to have it have exercise alone make a huge difference. But what I found personally is that the difference it made was just the mental well-being. I definitely felt different on days where I didn't row versus the days I did row. And that's a hard thing to not take note of, right? So I certainly think of myself now more as a person who exercises versus before, but that's still a solitary thing I'm doing. I'm doing it here in my home, where so many of us have been for the last 2 years. But as you just mentioned, the benefits of fitness as it relates to community and thinking about it in that way, it's just not something that ever occurred to me, that there are those benefits of connecting with other people, just given what happens to our bodies when we move, I guess, in unison.
Exactly. Yeah. We were, literally born to move, and historically from an evolutionary perspective, moving in sync with others, cooperating with others has been pretty key to human survival. So it runs really deep. And, I think, and this was one of the things that drew me to this topic. Very understandably, I think women's fitness culture and group fitness has been, has been looked at as for the ways in which it damages women, and it's been subject to a lot of critique, which, as I say, it warrants. But I think in that conversation, one thing that's been sort of overlooked is all of the fitness communities that have started to emerge or that have evolved, that are, they might not they might be a bit removed from that sort of sleek, sexy boutique fitness, culture that gets a lot of attention, but they're there and they're really meaningful for a lot of women. I think, it's been really interesting for me to even see my mom's relationship with exercise evolve. She's 74, and she discovered, she was an aerobics fan back in the day when I was born. And some of my earliest memories are of accompanying her sitting in the babysitting area. But she kind of rediscovered dance and what's now called cardio dance a few years ago. And she did keep up with it on Zoom. But once in-person classes returned, I mean, she has just talked to me about how the absence of it, made her realize how vital that community has become to her life. She's made new friends, in her early 70s, which we know it can be so hard to make friends later in life. And and I've experienced something similar through the running group that I'm a part of, which is, so not focused on anything cosmetic. So it can be sometimes hard, you have to maybe do a little bit of digging to find the right community for you, but they are out there.
Do you think that there is a recognition that for women in particular, the exercise and even potentially community-based exercise is important?
That's a great question. I mean, it's it's hard for me to separate sort of my perception of any cultural changes there, because that has been such an important goal of mine personally. Um, and so, I was really interested in, based on interviews that I did, how the rise of group fitness for women was a source of liberation.
Mm.
And what I heard very frequently in my interviews was that for many women who had really been denied sort of opportunities to, well, certainly to play sports, but to move, to feel comfortable in their bodies as girls and young women, discovering exercise for them was liberating on many levels, including the fact that for so much of women's history, our primary purpose was basically to serve others, to be wives and mothers and secretaries. And so stepping out of the home and into a space, a largely female space, where the sole purpose was just to, um, cultivate physical strength and to feel good in your body, was really significant for a lot of women, and in many cases empowered them to go on to kind of make changes in other parts of their life. I always think about a quote from Judy Shepard Missett, the creator of Jazzercise, who said that back when she first created Jazzercise, she created it in 1969. It took off throughout the 70s and early 80s. The women who were coming to her classes weren't necessarily out, trying to change the world at large, but they were changing their world. And, I think when enough women change their world, it can have a kind of collective impact on women's self-perception and the way they view their sense of space and power in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to think about it in that context, and I wonder if there is maybe that's like an upcoming article that you could consider, if it's just specifically the lens of women in terms of leadership and a career, and how that overlays with exercise. Because I don't think when I think about who were the first group of women who I heard about exercising on a routine basis, it wasn't for me until I started working, started my career. And I would look around, and all these women were like going and working out several times a week. And I thought, that's not something, I mean, I grew up, my mom was also in her early 70s, and I grew up at a time where, the exercise, it was more of what the first thing you described. It felt, I think, to people of my mom's generation, and I'm not going to speak to everyone, but just maybe because I'm more familiar with her and her group of friends, that it was a little bit of like, when everything else got done, kids, family, whatever else I had to do, exercise if I have time for it. But it was never something that they felt empowered to prioritize. If you had to think about how the book impacted you on your own journey, your own personal journey with exercise, how would you say that it's impacted you?
Yeah, it has impacted me in sort of like a million little ways. I've always personally been a fan of hidden histories, hidden cultural histories that give me kind of a new appreciation for the everyday. And so that was part of what intrigued me about this topic. And it was also the kind of story I wanted to tell. So by learning about the pioneers who really fought for women's right to move and who created opportunities and who were willing to be subversive, that has given me a much deeper appreciation for the opportunities that I have today. And that for me, that's just been wonderful to have that extra layer of kind of meaning infused in fitness. It's also, I'm much more aware now of all of the various kind of hidden forces that have been at play in women's fitness culture over time, including the forces that have tried to kind of harness fitness culture to be about encouraging women to want to constantly be improving on their bodies and changing the way they look. And so, like anyone, I'm still like, I will often feel, the urge to want to run, to maybe fit into a pair of jeans that's become a little too snug. Or I think the power of the makeover is really, kind of can't be understated. But the work that I've done has allowed me to kind of take a step back and say, okay, what am I really striving for here? What am I really hoping to accomplish? And I can feel a bit more in control of my actions that way.
Well, and I think too, understanding that that fitness is much broader than just about your appearance.
Yes.
And the benefits of doing it are, of being physical. And this is, I think, an interesting thing that I heard as you were talking, is it's about, a lot of this is the appreciation and value of movement.
Yes.
Right. Going back to what we were talking about with Bonnie Pruden, it's that appreciation and the freedom, right, that we can move, and what does that do for us, and how much positivity is associated with that.
Be so meaningful to people.
What do you hope that people take away from the book?
I think that if there's one kind of overarching message, is that women, I would just encourage women to move in ways that feel good for them. And for some women, that might be training for a marathon, or doing a boot camp, or just like pushing themselves to their absolute limits, strength training. For other women, that might be doing restorative yoga, or going for a walk around the block every day. And when we look at the research, it's no sort of surprise that even with all of the, even with how ubiquitous fitness culture is today, most Americans do not get the recommended daily amount of physical activity. I think a lot of women are still have the mentality that you mentioned, that your mother and her friends had, of it's sort of something, it's not a top priority because there are so many other things that have to get done first. And to be sure, there are many structural issues that prevent many of us from having the time or means or safe space to move. But I also think that as fitness became more of an industry, it was really marketed as something that if you wanted to participate, you had to kind of buy in literally to this whole way of life that involved, expensive memberships and a certain, moisture wicking uniform, and all of the accoutrement of fitness, which can just seem really overwhelming and daunting when you're already overwhelmed and burnt out. So I think that I would love to just see a shift. And this is something that I hope the book will, contribute to, in the way that we think about exercise and movement, so that it moves away from being maybe as performative as it's been over the past couple decades, and more just about a source of, a tool for mental health and emotional well-being, and for feeling good.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have one question that we love to ask everybody who comes on the show. So I would love, Danielle, if you could share with us, what piece of advice, or what do you wish you could tell your younger self? What do you want your younger self to know?
Great question. This is always a tricky question to answer, because I think that I actually tend to give my younger self a lot of grace. You know, I think part of it's intentional.
Mm.
I try to not live with regret, um, which I think, does require some trying. Um, and at the risk of maybe sounding a little bit cheesy, I honestly think I would tell my younger self thank you, because my younger self like did a lot of the really hard work that led me to the life that I live now, professionally, personally. I think, like so many women, I had, my share of struggles throughout my 20s and 30s. But I really tend to I see them as, um, challenging times that led to where I am today. And it wasn't all challenging times. I don't want to oversell it, but when I, when I think back to some of those challenging times, I'm just very grateful to my younger self for sticking with it and doing the work.
You're the first person, and I have asked many women this question. You're the first person who has ever said, I want to tell her thank you. That is, I'm literally choked up thinking about it, because it's what you started by saying, which is that you give your younger self grace. And there is such a gift in that, because I think we tend to look backwards and play, not to use a sports metaphor, but it's the only one I can think of, but we play Monday morning quarterback.
I love a good sports metaphor.
I know. Once I figured out what they were talking about.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Why Monday morning? Why?
Yeah,
I'm not a football fan.
No, neither am I.
But once, when you think about the fact that we tend to look back and think, well, why did we do that? We beat ourselves up. And I'll tell you that a lot of the theme of what I hear when I ask women the question is, it's going to be okay. That's a big theme.
Yeah.
I would tell my younger self, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Right? Because we gain experience over the years, and we learn that things that maybe we would freak out about when we were younger, they're just, it's going to be okay. Don't freak out about it. A lot of people go with that same notion, right? Failure's not fatal, things like that, to kind of like tell their younger self that. But I love this idea of being thankful to yourself when you were younger, because what it says is she was a huge foundational part of where you are today.
Which I believe. Yeah.
And
I would also,
love that.
I think telling her that it would be okay is a close second, but
yes.
But yeah, I wouldn't be anywhere without that younger self.
Amen.
In the time.
Well, Danielle, thank you so much for spending your time with us. If people want to follow you, we will obviously be mentioning to them where they can pick up the book. But if people want to follow you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram at Danielle Friedman Writes, where I share a lot of fun archival fitness materials and thoughts about all of these topics. I'm on Twitter at dfriedmanwrites, and you can also visit my website, which is danielle-friedman.com.
Danielle, thank you so much for joining us today and for doing this work, which I think is so important for women to understand and kind of see how we've evolved. I love it. So thank you for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much. This has been so much fun.